Today, we are talking about God being near to the brokenhearted victim, to those who have been under conflict, to those who have been persecuted, to those who have been just attacked by the enemy, flesh and blood or not. And we'll get to that back at the end of the message. But here's what we have on tap today. Our theology is this: God will vindicate the oppressed and persecuted. God will vindicate the oppressed and persecuted. And our application today is this: cry out to God for rescue and trust his justice. Cry out to God for rescue and trust his justice. And our prayer today is, God, deliver us from the wicked and those who rise up against you. When we think about our enemies, we probably tend to make it more personal. We probably tend to think about like the person who cut us off in traffic. We're like, man, you don't know. Like every day on the way to work, there's this guy who cuts me off in traffic. We probably kind of make it something like that. Usually in the Bible, it's not always the case, but a lot of times in the Bible, the enemy being talked about is those who have set themselves up against God, or those who have set themselves up as hostile towards God. It's interesting, though, because David spends a lot of time praying. We're going to start off in Psalm 55 if you want to join me there. But also, I think you'll really enjoy 2 Samuel 22. We'll be in both of those texts this morning, Psalm 55 and 2 Samuel 22. But David is frequently asking for rescue from his enemies. In fact, at the end of David's life, or towards the end of David's life, when he decides he wants to build a temple for the Lord, he begins to do that process, and the prophet comes to him and says, no, it's not for you to build the temple of the Lord. You're a man of bloodshed. You're a man of war. It'll be for your son to build the temple. And so David was a man of bloodshed. David was a man of war. He was almost always at war in his reign. And even prior to being king, he was part of kind of the court and the military system of King Saul, the king before him. And then King Saul got jealous of him and decided he wanted him dead. And so King Saul was always chasing David. David's son Absalom decided he wanted his father dead and was chasing David. Like David always had enemies. And so a lot of the Psalms of David are, God, rescue me from my enemies. And he's talking really practically about a king, King Saul. He's talking practically about his son. He's talking practically about the Philistines that are coming against him. But there's this idea in the Bible of being just oppressed by the wicked, oppressed by those who would persecute us and come against us. We have brothers and sisters all around the world, brothers and sisters in Christ, who serve Christ at the risk of their own lives. And they're doing that all the time. And there's a part of us, and certainly a part of them, that's saying, God, rescue us, deliver us from these people who would seek to have our lives come to an end. So I want to begin in Psalm 55. If you're feeling oppressed today, if you're feeling attacked today, or if you just have a very tender heart and you are thinking about our brothers and sisters in Afghanistan, or our brothers and sisters in China, or different places where at the cost of their lives people are coming to faith, and you're like, God, protect them. If that's kind of your prayer, I want us to have that kind of stuff in mind today. Psalm 55, beginning in verse 1, David says this: Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan because of the noise of my enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they drop trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, O Lord, that I had wings like a dove, and I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find a shelter from the raging wind and the tempest. All right, so bear with me here for just a second. See if some of this resonates with you. See if you felt this way before. David is asking for mercy because of the oppression of the wicked, because of the noise of his enemy. They're bearing a grudge against him. And he says, my heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling have come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. I don't know if you felt that before. Like you felt so oppressed before, you felt so afflicted before, you felt like people were coming against you one after the other. But this is what makes it particularly offensive to David in this part. Jump down to verse 12. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together within God's house. We walked in the throng. Let death still over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive, for evil is their dwelling place and in their heart. So David says, look, God, I've got an enemy. I've got an enemy that's coming against me. And then he kind of tweaks his language a little bit and says, and it's not the enemy or the adversary I expected. It's a close friend of mine, one who used to come alongside me and worship with me in the house of the Lord. And so he feels attacked. He feels threatened by someone who was once a close friend. So we're going to kind of go through three scenarios here, right? So in this case, it was not someone who David expected would come against him. And listen, but David is crying out for mercy. David is crying out for rescue from this. David is crying out for just deliverance from this. And I love verse 16. Listen to what he says. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon, I utter my complaint, and I moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. God will give ear, and he will humble them, the one who is enthroned from of old, because they do not change, and they do not fear God. That is key. Okay? These enemies of David, these enemies that we're going to talk about today, all have this in common. They do not fear God. They do not reverence God. They do not honor God. All right? Now, here's what's interesting about this, right? David is saying these were people, in this case, in this text, David is saying, it wasn't like I expected. It wasn't like my murderous adversary that I know is coming for my head. It was a close friend that is now hunting me. And what does he say about his close friend? He says, this person has no reverence for God. They have no fear for God. I think all of us, well, I can't say that. I can't say all of us. Let me not say all of us. Let me say it differently and say many of us who have been in church our entire lives or have been in church for several decades at least have seen people within the church that we thought were faithful to God and honoring to God and glorifying to God that now have nothing to do with God. And it stabbed at our heart and it wounded us. We have... In this church, we have a previous pastor who has left the faith and has left the Lord and has had nothing to do with God since he left 4 years ago, 3 years ago. Hadn't even been that long. Wow, it feels like it's been a really long time. And he, early on, I don't know if he still does or not, but early on, he would say a lot of bad things about us and about the church here. And we just were like, all right, like, okay, that's fine. This person doesn't know God. This person who was my close friend, who stood alongside me has now become my enemy, has now become my adversary. I don't feel like David in this place. I don't feel like my soul is trembling within me. But you can imagine that situation, right? Where someone who was a close friend, who seemed to have a heart for God, has now turned away from you, has now turned away from God, and this once close friend has now become your enemy. And we go, what do we do in that moment? And the answer is, what we do in that moment is we call out to God, and we say, I call to God, and God will rescue me. He will deliver me evening, morning, and noon. Throughout all the day, I call out to God, I weep, I lay my supplication before the Lord, and I ask that God would intervene in this, because I know that this person is far from God. I know, and so God, deliver me from those. Here's what I need us to get. This is not deliver me from my boss who's a jerk to me sometimes. This is deliver me from those who are ultimately your enemies, oh God. These are people who are far from you, oh God, even though in this case, at one point they looked like my close acquaintance. Even though in this case they looked at one point like my close friend. And so David is calling out for that rescue. David is calling out for that deliverance. And he is calling out that God would be near him. Now, what we're going to learn from this, what we need to learn from this is that when people come against us, when we feel oppressed, when we feel beset, when we feel like the enemies surrounding us are innumerable, what our correct response is to cry out to God. He is near to those who are the victim. He is near to those who would be oppressed. He is near to those who are persecuted. He is near to those who find themselves surrounded by the enemy. And so whether evening, noon, or night, or evening and night, evening, morning, or noon, we call out to God and we ask that God would deliver us, right? Spoiler alert, kind of getting to the punchline a little bit earlier. Sometimes the deliverance won't come until Christ returns. Just know that ahead of time, all right? but it's coming. And what I want us to understand is that God hears us. He knows our brokenness. He knows that the enemy is besetting us, but he also will bring deliverance because he is a God of justice. He will accomplish these things. Our application today, and we're not quite done with this story of David, but our application today is this: cry out to God for rescue and trust his justice. Cry out to God for rescue and trust his justice. Now, here's what I want us to look at. This is from 2 Samuel 22. 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18 are identical, okay? The psalmist, David records it in the Psalms, and then Samuel records it for us in the life of David. But 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18 are identical. And I'm going to read a somewhat lengthy section here. I want you to hear what is said. This is when David is fleeing from Saul, okay, the king who is trying to kill him. David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hands of all of his enemies, from the hand of Saul. And he said, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God and my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge. My Savior, you save me from violence. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. For the waves of death encompassed me, and the torrents of destruction assailed me, and the cords of Sheol entangled me, and the snares of death confronted me." Have you ever felt that way? Like you're on the verge of death, right? And maybe figuratively, maybe literally, for the waves of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord, and my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. Now, let's pause here for just a moment. I love this text, all right? One of the things that I said last week that I want to reiterate is let us cast aside this kind of idea where we have to be prim and proper to approach God. Let's cast aside this idea where we've got to, be buttoned up and have our shirt tucked in and wear, be fancy and be like, "Oh, Lord God." I have been parts of pastoral prayer groups where you're talking to a guy and he talks normal, and then all of a sudden, he goes into kind of this weird kind of character when he prays, and he's like, "Oh, our holiest, thouest," and you're like, oh, there's all these F's on the end of his words, and you're like, man, a minute ago you ordered a chicken fried steak, not a chicken frieth. You know what I mean? Just talk to God, Now, if you're an eth person, that's okay, all right? But what I'm saying is we don't have to be different than who we are when we come to God, all right? If you're an eth person, if you're a Shakespearean kind of thing, you feel like that language is more elegant, and that's how you are, go for it. First of all, I want to know why, because that's really interesting. And can I write a story about you someday? Because that's peculiar. But the point being, be who you are before God. We don't have to be something different than we are. We don't have to put on airs. David says, man, I came to you in my brokenness. I came to you when my voice, with my voice, because I was distressed and I was trembling. Sometimes just soak the carpet in your tears and just say, "God, move this mountain, do something." And that's what David does. And I love this text. Then the earth reeled and rocked, and the foundations of heaven trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth, and glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He was seen on the wings of the wind. He made darkness around him his canopy, thick clouds a gathering of water. Out of the brightness before him, coals of fire flamed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven. The Lord Most High uttered his voice, and he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and routed them. And the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare. And at the rebuke of the Lord, and at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. And you're just going, whoa, right? This is God hearing the prayer of David and not just showing up. It's not God shows up. This reminds me, it's a different situation, but it reminds me of a text in Isaiah where the prophet Isaiah says, "Lord, rend the heavens apart and come down and put your feet on the earth such that they tremble." There is a desire, and here's what I want us to catch. There is a desire, at least there should be a desire in us, that those who are our enemies, but ultimately enemies of God, there should be a desire in us for justice. There should be a desire that God would take what is wicked and put it in its rightful place in death or Sheol or what. And there should be a desire in us that God would work what is right. This is Abraham seeing God about to go down and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's like, yeah, but God, what if there are righteous people there? Like, he wants the wicked to be dealt with, but he wants the righteous to be delivered. And there should be a desire in us for the judge of all the earth to do what is just and to accomplish his will, and we can cry out, and God doesn't just go, oh, is it time? Like, do you hear this language? Do you see the power with which God moves against injustice? Do you see how he takes hold of the prayer of David and how he moves? Now, this is really interesting. Let me find it really quickly. Hold on just a second. All right, listen to this. Look at verse 41, same text, 2 Samuel 22:41. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, those who hated me, and I destroyed them. They looked, but there was none to save. Look at verse 42. They cried out to the Lord, but he did not answer them. All right, catch this. Verse 7, in my distress I called out to the Lord. And how does God answer? Verses 8 through 16, the earth shakes, the foundations of the mountains are moved, God comes down with power. The enemies of God, ultimately that's what it is here, the enemies of God cry out to God, but what? He doesn't hear them. All right? Now, we got to go back here. This is a messed up kind of text. I know you're going to be like, whoa, wait a minute. Look at the introduction of this text. Verse 1, David spoke to the Lord when the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. King Saul has just died in battle. King Saul's been hunting David for a few years now. King Saul just died in battle against the Philistines. And David, this is the song he writes. And he says, he goes, I was weary. I was in distress. My enemies have beset me. My enemies have come against me. And I called out to the Lord, and this is what the Lord has done. Man, he came down with power and fire and brimstone, and he destroyed my enemy. And he goes, and they called out. My enemy called out to God, but he didn't hear him. It's interesting because at the very end of 1 Samuel, right before King Saul goes into battle, God has already removed his love from King Saul. He's already taken his spirit from King Saul. And King Saul comes to a witch, to a medium, and he says, I need to talk to Samuel the prophet. Samuel has already died. And Saul is seeking counsel from God through this dead prophet. And the prophet says, why'd you wake me up, man? He goes, God's already told you. He's washed his hands of you. So I need you to catch this. David says, God, you got to save me. And God comes in and saves David. Saul says, God, what are you going to do? And God goes, man, I'm not hearing it. Because the difference between the righteous and the wicked, because of the difference between the relationship. David has this relationship with God and he is righteous. Now, listen, are there righteous people who die at the hands of the enemies? Yes. If you need to remember that Christ was completely righteous, and the Bible tells us was handed over into the hands of wicked men for the hour of darkness so that his death would be accomplished, so that salvation could be given. Like, there is no one righteous like Christ, and Christ was handed over to wicked men, right? It has been a theological truth that the blood of the saints has watered the seeds of revival and redemption, and that as people die for Christ, the gospel is spread. Are we always going to be rescued from our enemies? Maybe not this man in this moment, but God always hears, and he always brings about justice, always. Let me give you this example, just so that this shaking of the mountains, we don't have mountains around here. Although, you know what? Like, let's just be really honest. Driving out towards Ruidoso here about, 4 hours down the road. I think that growing up and being around this area, I've always thought like San Angelo is flat, but San Angelo is not flat. Flat is about 4 hours west of here, and there's nothing, right? San Angelo, Cristobal area, like it's nice here, I grew up in Midland. Midland's flat, This is nicer, but so we don't have a lot of mountains, but we have some hills and some creek beds and stuff to shake. And so if you're sitting here going, man, God, deliver me and shake the creek beds, That could be impressive too, all right? That could be pretty. Shake the mighty oaks, and the cypress along the rivers. There's some big cypress next to the river we're going to today. But here's something I want you to catch. In Revelation 6, I believe it's the fifth seal that's opened. And in Revelation 6, the fifth seal is opened. Revelation 6, 9 through 11. And there are some souls under the altar who have been martyred for the cause of Christ. These are people who died for the cause of Christ. And they're going, how much longer, O Lord? How much longer until you get vindication on our enemies? How much longer? And he gives them white robes to dress themselves in. And he goes, just a little while longer. Here's what I need you to hear, okay? David was rescued from his enemy practically in his flesh and blood body. There are souls under the altar. There's big debate about whether it's real or symbolic. I think it's real. That's just where I stand on it. We can talk about that another time later, but I don't think it's just symbolism. I think that these are the souls that were martyred who are under the altar of God, who are crying out to God for vindication and retribution against their enemies, and they are crying out, and he goes, hang on, just a little bit longer, and he gives them white robes, and he goes, in a little bit longer, I'll show the deliverance. So here's what I need you to understand. God is near to the brokenhearted victim. He has not forgotten the souls under that are under the altar. They are not less than because he rescued David immediately, but told the souls under the altar just a little bit longer. Here's what I need you to know. Whatever state we find ourselves in with the enemies of God, whatever position we find ourselves in, whether they appeared to be close friends, whether they were always secret enemies, whether they were coming after us directly because we were followers of Christ, or here in just a moment what we'll see is spiritual enemies, whatever our enemy is, God hears us when we call out to him, and he either shakes the mountains or the creek beds of Cristobal now or says just a little bit longer. But here's what I need you to know. Deliverance is coming. Rescue is coming, and vindication is coming, and the enemy will be shown to be the enemy and will be cast down, and the righteous will be shown to be the righteous and will be upheld. So if you feel like your enemies are beyond counting and you are overwhelmed, deliverance is coming. Maybe tomorrow, and maybe after you're dead, but God has not ignored you. And he hears your cries, and he is bringing with him rescue. There is rescue coming. There is vindication coming. There is righteousness coming. Ephesians 6, at the end of Ephesians, tells us this. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritualities. Wow. Principalities and spiritual forces in the heavenly places. Let me give you, I want to give you more than this, but I'm not going to. Here's the nutshell version of Ephesians. The Ephesian church was divided. Gentiles on one side, Jews on the other side. And God, through Paul, is saying, you're not supposed to be fighting with each other. You're fighting a spiritual war. So I've done this quickly. Bear with me. Whether your enemy is the one who seemed close to you, whether your enemy is the one who is hunting your life because they don't like your position like Saul was hunting David, whether your enemy is like those in Revelation who are killing you because you are a follower of Christ, or whether your enemy is spiritual. There are real angels and there are real demons, and there is a real world that exists all around us right now that you and I do not always behold. And I say do not always behold because some have beheld it. There is a spiritual war right now happening. For the souls of men and women, for this land, for this place, there is a spiritual war happening. Our wrestle isn't with each other. We certainly perceive it as with each other sometimes, but behind every idol is a demon, the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy. Behind every false god is a demonic force, and everybody who would reject God, which, by the way, are all the people in this category, these enemies of David, these enemies, all the people who have rejected God are in service not to God, but ultimately to the devil. And our wrestle is ultimately against him. And here's what I need you to know. Cry out evening, morning, and noon from a broken heart and say, God, deliver us. God, rescue us. Do you remember the demoniac in Luke 8? There's a demoniac. He's got a legion of demons in him. We don't ever know the guy's name who's possessed by a legion of demons, but Jesus asks his name, and he says, they call me Legion because I have many demons. That's why, right? What's your name? Legion, because there are many of us. And this guy is naked, and he's running around the tombs, and whenever they would chain him up, he'd break the chains, and he'd run around the tombs, and like just kind of overall just a freaky situation, like, hey, let's go to the market today. Isn't that by the tombs? Oh, yeah, let's not go that way. Let's go. Like, you just probably don't want to see the naked guy running around breaking chains, maybe you do. Maybe that's your thing. But it's a terrifying situation. And Christ shows up, and he speaks to the demons, come out, and they're like, don't cast us into the abyss before it's time. Interesting statement. Don't cast us into the abyss yet. They know what's coming. If you've ever wondered if the devil knows what's coming, he absolutely knows what's coming. The demons absolutely know what's coming. The demons are like, don't cast us into the abyss before our time. They know that they have a time. They know that. Matthew 25 tells us that hell was created for the devil and his followers, right? Hell was not created for the wicked people. Wicked people who reject God get the same judgment that the devil and the demons get. Do not think that the devil lives in hell, that that's his home, that he runs it. It is his judgment. And he knows that his time is coming to an end. And these demons go, don't send us. Don't send us into the abyss yet. Let us go into these pigs over here. And he sends the demons out into a herd of pigs, and the pigs run down this hillside into the water and all drown themselves. Insane. And everybody who's watching that goes, what in the world just happened? And now this guy's sitting here dressed and in his right mind, and people come from town to see this guy, and they're seeing this guy who had 2,000 demons in him now talking and acting correctly, and they're like, what in the world? And he goes, Jesus, let me go with you. And Jesus goes, no, stay in your city, stay in the Decapolis, stay in the with cities, and go and proclaim what God has done for you. God cares for the victim. He cares for the oppressed. He cares for those who under the rule of Satan, those who are the enemies of God, who beset us and come against us. Don't make this, please, listen. I don't even know if I should say this. Let me think for just a minute. What would Micah say to me after I said this? There are world politics that set themselves up against God. I'll say it this way. There are world politics that set themselves up against God. My message this morning is not inherently political. So if you leave here and you go, oh, Ryan gave a good political message this morning, you've misheard me. But there are politics that set themselves up against God. And what I need us to get is that all who set themselves up against God, whether a close friend, a sneaky enemy, an actual enemy who wants to kill us because we're Christians, like they're very overt about their purposes, like I hate you because you're a Christian, whether it's demonic forces, what I need us to get is that this collective group of people and spirits that say we are against God and what he stands for. I need us to know two things. One, cry out to God for deliverance, and two, deliverance is certain. I need you to know those two things. Soak your carpet, wipe your snot all over your sleeves, rend your heart before God, lay it bare before God, and say, God, my enemy has beset me, deliver me. And either he will shake the mountains or say, just a little bit longer. But with certainty, rescue is coming. So those of you who feel overwhelmed by the enemy, rescue is coming. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is found in 1 Kings chapter 6. And in 1 Kings chapter 6, there's this guy named Elisha. He's a prophet. There's this wicked king who keeps trying to attack the Israelites, and he sends soldiers to go and attack the Israelites while they're on the road here and there. And the Israelites are always warned by Elisha, don't take that road. There's some people waiting to attack you. So they always go a different way. Eventually the king goes, who in the world is telling the king of Israel, who's ratting me out? How do they always avoid us? And somebody goes, it's the prophet Elisha. And he goes, let's go get him. They send the entire army to go get Elisha. The entire army of this wicked king to go get one dude. And they come and they stand outside of his house. And the servant goes out in the morning for whatever reason he's going out in the morning, use the restroom or whatever. When I tell the story, I pretend like he's going out to get the paper because in my head it's funnier. But he's going out, right? I picture Elisha's house with a little sidewalk on the front, some, flower beds. Not like that at all. I get that, okay? Don't come up to me afterwards and go, well, they probably didn't have flowers. I get that. I know, all right? But the servant goes out, for whatever reason he goes out for. In my mind, it's always the newspaper in the little, rainproof sheet, and he's, picking it up, and then he looks up and he sees the army. At some point, after going outside, he sees this army surrounding him, and he goes, oh. And he backs into the house, at least in my head he does. He goes back into the house, and he gets Elisha, the prophet. And I kind of just picture him just kind of slowly backing up. And he goes, Elisha, you got to see this. And Elisha comes out, and he's like, yeah. And then the Bible says this. Elisha says God opened his eyes. Elisha is not worried at all about this earthly enemy that has surrounded him. And Elisha goes, God, open his eyes. Elisha doesn't panic. Elisha doesn't freak out. And right above this earthly army is a heavenly army of fire that way outnumbers the earthly army. And Elisha goes, we have more with us than they do with them. Here's what I need you to know. You will never have a time in your life, in your living, breathing, flesh and blood life, you will never have a time you're free of enemies, ever. Because Satan and the demons are always against us. You will never have a time in your living, breathing life where you're free of enemies. But you can always call out to God, and rescue is 100% guaranteed in this moment or the next. And that brings us to our prayer. God, deliver us from the wicked and those who rise up against you. God, deliver us from the wicked and those who rise up against you. And I won't belabor the point. So would you take a moment right where you are to pray that this morning? God, deliver us from the wicked and those who rise up against you. God, we've had enemies. Some of them have been our close friends who have turned against us. Some of them have sought to subvert our lives, to undermine everything we've done. Some of them have been very overt in their hatred for us because of our following of you. And God, there isn't a day, not a moment, not a second that passes that we don't have the spiritual enemy and the forces in heavenly places that are against us. We know we have enemies. We know that there's an entire world and an entire spiritual army that sets itself up against you. We know that. And we ask for deliverance. We ask for rescue. We ask for your intervention. And God, whether you come down and you rend the heavens apart and you shake the earth with the thunder of your voice, or whether, God, we have to wait a little bit, just a little bit. We rejoice and rest in the truth that you have heard us and that you are near is certain.